Alright, before we get started, I want to get this out of the way first. What I'm about to say in this video is not directed at all boomers. This also isn't an attack on boomers, it's simply a study on how social network sites, particularly Facebook, have been successful in manipulating the opinions and ideologies of boomers more than any other generation. I'm also going to be making some jokes here and there, but please just take them in your stride. They come from a place of love and not hate. Anyway, here's the jingle thing. If you're aged 18 to 34, which I know is likely since most of my viewers are, there's a very good chance that you or someone in your family has some questionable takes. It could be your grandparents, your uncle or aunt, or possibly even your parents. Personally, I have quite a few in my family, and it's definitely a frustrating experience. To paraphrase a well-known saying, it can be like playing chess with a pigeon. No matter how good you are, the pigeon will still strut around knocking over pieces and act like it won the game. I have a couple of people in my family whom I'm not going to call out here, but they used to be pretty progressive people, and to some extent they still are. They care about the working class and the downtrodden. They agree that there shouldn't be a thing such as billionaires, and that they do more damage to the world than they do good. However, despite these beliefs, they're still adamant that immigration is out of control, that we allow too many refugees into the country, that certain ethnic groups are responsible for most of the crime, and it's contributing to most of society's ills, which honestly astounds me since my family contains an immigrant, two if you count myself. But this is linked to the all too common belief that there are good immigrants and bad immigrants. It can often feel like an unwinnable battle to change people's minds, and I'm sure you felt the same way. You may have even given up and tried to accept that that's just them, they're set in their ways, and that's understandable. The shift in my family members came seemingly out of nowhere. I was surprised to hear that the people that had known me since I was born felt such a way, and that they were willing to defend politicians who were happy to make the world a worse place for them just to justify the wealthy. As their ideology shifted and copies of the Daily Mail newspaper began appearing on the coffee table more often, I noticed something important: that their Facebook feeds were regularly becoming a hotbed for inflammatory opinions, poorly sourced news stories that were scaremongering against the other, and dangerous lies about everything from Black Lives Matter to COVID-19 cures. Friends and other relatives were distributing these lies back and forth, from dubious articles by the Daily Wire to edited out-of-context videos of black people beating up a white person allegedly during the Black Lives Matter protests. My family was being given small doses of misinformation daily and didn't even realize, kind of like radiation or carbon monoxide poisoning. You don't know it's happening until the symptoms start showing. There are hundreds of thousands of people from Generation X to the silent generation who have been exposed like this, but I would argue that the generation most vulnerable to this poisoning and capable of inflicting the most damage are boomers. And Facebook is to blame. It does not care about preventing the exposure of misinformation. Instead, their users are spoon-fed lies by their algorithm to generate outrage and clicks. Even if they did care, the site has become an uncontrollable beast that's almost impossible to self-regulate with over 2.8 billion users. Let's explore how Facebook radicalized boomers. Facebook is one of the most used and one of the most influential websites in the world. Although it might be easy to look at something like Facebook and think it's just a way for people to connect with each other, it's done far, far more than that. Of course, it's created new relationships, kept people in touch from across the world, and helped us share our lives with people who might not live near us anymore. It looks innocent on the surface, just something that exists to make life easier and obviously make ludicrous amounts of money by selling your personal data. Over time though, it's become more and more apparent that Facebook has become something dangerous. And even though it was created with the intention of helping people create networks with friends and family, that functionality has been adopted by corporations, media outlets, politicians, reactionaries, provocateurs, and more to manipulate the flow of information into our personal online spaces and how we perceive it. Before Facebook, the way we consumed information was confined to well more defined networks. If you wanted to read the news, then you'd visit a news website. If you wanted to watch a video, then you'd visit a site like YouTube. If you wanted to interact with a company, you'd go to their website. And of course, if you wanted to communicate, you'd use a dedicated service like email or instant messenger. Facebook has, in essence, taken this online experience and condensed it into one site. The news comes to you. If you think that other people should hear about something, then you can share it. Saw a video on your feed that you thought was interesting? Just click share. Want to talk to Target and accuse them of being part of the Illuminati? Go right ahead. Facebook has become core to the browsing experience for many. It's a site where they can visit if they just want to kill some time. Compared to younger generations, boomers don't tend to visit many websites or use more than one or two social networks, so their experiences online are confined to Facebook's ecosystem, and that limited scope of information can be heavily influential on how someone perceives the world. Now, to tackle this subject, we're going to look at numerous factors. This includes the cognitive psychology of aging, the politics of boomers, the world in which they were raised in, their perception of themselves relative to other generations, and how sites like Facebook distribute and regulate information, and how institutions use the platform to distribute information too, be it true or false. To get started though, let's look at how technologies such as the internet and Facebook have been introduced into the lives of people born long after the dawn of the information age and how they use it. If you're someone that knew what the screams of a 56k modem sounded like before you tasted your first sip of alcohol, or perhaps you grew up in a household without a VHS player, the internet has more than likely played an important part throughout the majority of your life. For younger generations, it's becoming hard to imagine a time before the internet, even for older millennials. For most boomers, the internet has been present for less than half of their lives. It's relatively new to them and something that they've had to go out of their way to learn since it's become such a crucial part of our daily lives. They were accustomed to a time where things such as paying power bills or applying for a job were all done in person or through the mail or even over the phone, but now that pretty much all is done online. All the generations had to adapt or fall behind. As a result, there's been some resistance. I'm sure you'll have heard plenty of older people saying that the internet has made things more complicated and how things used to be more simple, but that kind of sentiment is the result of finding it hard to reckon with a world that's changing around them, which is an important factor that we'll touch on later. Younger generations are more than familiar with the internet largely due to the fact that the majority, if not all of their formal education included it. It also helps that younger people, especially children and teens, are much faster learners, and it becomes significantly more difficult as you enter adulthood. We grew up understanding how useful and important the internet was, and over time it became apparent that it wasn't just a passing fad. Much to the chagrin of generations that are older than us though, much of the world also realized how useful and convenient the internet was for pretty much everything. So the old way of doing things started to transition to the online world. At first it was just things like sending mail, buying goods, and getting information, but eventually a substantial amount of our social lives ended up moving online, starting with early social networks like MySpace and then eventually Facebook. Older generations were initially averse to using social networks because it was just another one of those things that they believed they didn't need a substitute for, but over time more and more of them began to realize that sites like Facebook might not be a replacement for socializing, but a supplement, a way for them to keep in touch with their friends and family without having to spend hours on the phone in the evening or traveling. They could talk to them whenever they want, stay updated with their lives, and even reconnect with friends that they haven't heard from in decades. At this point, an echo chamber is created in the form of a newsfeed. Friends will post pictures, life events, and of course, minion memes. More importantly, this echo chamber serves as a method for friends and loved ones to start posting and sharing opinions and articles, etc. This is the point where Facebook goes from being just a tool for sharing your life with others, but a method of indoctrination via repetition of information, and said information being considered true by virtue of who shared it. In a study from Harvard's Department of Psychology by Brashear and Schachter, they observed that older adults' peripheral social partners shrink as they age. This happens in various ways, including relocating, retiring, leaving the house less often, and of course, illness and death. Joining a platform like Facebook allows boomers to maintain stronger links with these partners. In general, we all tend to trust those who are close to us, but a neuroimaging study found that older adults tended to go with their gut instincts less than young people, and when shown pictures of strangers, they were more open to trusting them than the young people were. This might sound like a good thing, since it's not great to live your life feeling like you can't trust anyone, but it also means that they're more susceptible to lies. A lack of familiarity with technology contributes to many boomers' inability to distinguish something, whether it's true or false, or even if it's a bot, a fake account, a scam, fake news. But when this is paired with a willingness to trust others for their word, especially their friend, it results in someone who's willing to accept falsehoods simply because it came from the mouth or Facebook feed of someone that they deem trustworthy. It also doesn't help that boomers understandably don't like their misplaced trust being questioned, and when the validity of the information a friend has shared on Facebook is questioned by a third party, they will be liable to defend them and claim that their loved ones wouldn't spread lies. This is just one part of what could be considered an incredibly long sequence. This isn't just your grandpa you're dealing with, it's a long chain of grandpas, grandmas, your parents, each reading these lies presented as facts, spreading them further and rejecting criticism when they're faced with it. To make matters worse, when a lot of people have their beliefs or truths questioned, they're more likely to stand by them even more, especially when it confirms a pre-existing bias. As I mentioned earlier, Facebook feeds can turn into what is essentially an echo chamber. The people inside them might be spreading lies and unknowingly doing so. In the same paper by Brashear and Schachter, they found an interesting discrepancy when it came to perceptions of truth. It's easy to assume that boomers' lack of familiarity with the internet might make them more likely to believe fake headlines, but in fact it's the opposite. A study by Alcott and Genstkow that took place after the 2016 US election where Donald Trump won presented numerous headlines to participants, some true and some false. They concluded that the ability to distinguish fake from true headlines actually improved with age. This wasn't just a one-time conclusion too. 3 years later, Pennycook and Rand performed the same experiment again and reached the same conclusion as they did before. So why do so many boomers fall for fake headlines? Well, as we mentioned before, who shares these stories matters greatly, so if a friend or family member was to share one on Facebook, their trust in them grants the headline some truth as well. Boomers' desire and value for truth has also been exploited by media outlets. Right-wing cable news networks such as Fox and OAN constantly love to reaffirm that they're trustworthy and unbiased, and that in turn other outlets aren't to be trusted. Social networks and the companies that use them thrive on repetition, and this is where older adults become more vulnerable. Although boomers have excelled in recognizing true headlines from fake headlines at first glance, seeing the same or similar headlines over and over again can eventually convince them that it's true. There's a name for this too, the illusory truth effect. In a nutshell, this is a technique where something is shown to a person multiple times over a period of time, and that familiarity with it can eventually persuade someone that it's true or even good. That repetition can also gradually override what people believe to be true to begin with, especially if the new information they're learning appeals to pre-existing bias. So, for example, if you have a boomer that doesn't like a public figure, let's say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if they see a story posted on their feed that says AOC wants to ban cows because their farts are causing climate change, at first someone might see that headline and think, well, that's obviously ridiculous, it's not true, come on. But then they see a friend that posted on Facebook. Then another friend comments saying how she's a communist trying to take away our beef. and suddenly you're curious now that 2 of your friends are engaging with this subject. You see how many times it's been shared, the likes, the reactions, and then you see another friend posted it from a different website, and that has shares as well, and tons of angry comments. Next thing you know, you see it on Fox News in the evening, and they're outraged, so now because all these people are given their time to talk about it, there must be some truth to it. The next day comes, you look at your Facebook, and you see it even more since your friends watched the news last night, and they learned about it too. The chain reaction continues, and the story gets more and more valid. This was actually a real story that was spread around in early 2019, but despite it being false, the damage had already been done. The people who already disliked AOC disliked her even more now, and many who were on the fence probably got pushed over to the other side. They may have even heard that it was false, but still wonder to themselves, this time it wasn't true, but what about next time? The illusory truth effect is a phenomenon that was noticed as early as the late 70s, and it's a PR tactic that's been in use much longer than that, especially in advertising and even in propaganda. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily matter whether you believe in what's being repeated. If it affects you on an emotional level, like in this case feeling negative towards AOC, then it's successful. Bless you. Sites like Facebook were a blessing to advertisers, but they were also greatly beneficial to news networks and, of course, politicians. Political campaigns are extremely expensive, but millions of boomers spreading a politician's rhetoric and lies across the internet has become a priceless method of appealing to voters, arguably more so than any campaign ad ever. The fake news origin source benefits from the clicks too, the person who spread it believes that they benefit, and of course, at the end of the day, Facebook benefits. Like many other websites that you can access for free, Facebook is fueled by clicks and engagement with others. Facebook is doing all it can to make you a one-stop spot for everything that you need online: socializing, entertainment, information, news, and more. Facebook has even begun to create originally produced content with Facebook Watch, where you can watch shows such as Will Smith's Bucket List, I Want My Phone Back, and of course, Big Chicken Shack. Don't worry, I didn't know they were making content until I started writing this. The only big thing that Facebook doesn't really involve itself in is online shopping, since that corner's pretty much monopolized by Amazon, but don't be surprised if you see them give it a shot in the future. Because of Facebook's desire to keep you on their site, they give you a method of engaging with others in numerous ways. This can be as simple as leaving a comment or a react, which also helps on YouTube by the way, so if you fancy engaging with my content, be my guest. Engagement with a post helps propel it in front of more people, especially when that post is from something big like a news outlet and has a large platform to begin with. Over time, Facebook's algorithm paints a picture of the kind of things that you may not necessarily want to see, but the things that you're likely to engage with. If you post pics about food or talk about foods, you'll more than likely see posts promoting restaurants or sites for recipes. If you follow pages related to video games, then you'll see posts for new or upcoming games. And if you make posts saying that you love Ed Sheeran's music, you'll get ads for dumpster rentals, because that's where he belongs. Okay, I'm only kidding. This algorithm works the same with politics too. If you've engaged with a post saying that AOC wants to ban cows, then Facebook will take this and show you other posts that might be similar to it. For a good while, conservatives were accusing Facebook of being unbiased and promoting left-leaning news outlets over conservative ones. Republicans in the US, since around the time Trump came to prominence, have made constant claims that they are being erased from the internet, including from things such as Google searches. This claim was demonstrably false, since much like Facebook, Google's algorithm prioritizes searches which are being engaged with the most and are most relevant. Facebook took heed of this accusation though, and made changes to its algorithm around 2018, but whether it was intentional or not, Facebook has now become a hive for conservatives, and even those on the extreme right. Facebook now has far more in the way of right-wing engagement than it does the left, whether it's people clicking on a link from the Daily Wire or even sharing dangerous conspiracies. Employees at Facebook have even admitted that they don't know how it turned out this way, and that left-leaning news sites such as Mother Jones have reported a substantial drop in revenue after the change. The thing is though, and this is just me speaking, I find it hard to believe that this wasn't intentional. My take is that Facebook understood that there was a growing number of older adults joining the site and more younger people leaving it behind for sites such as Twitter or even Instagram, which incidentally is also owned by Facebook. Seeing this, I believe they seized the opportunity to take advantage of an audience that not only is more susceptible to fake news, but more likely to share it. In July last year, New York Times journalist Kevin Roose pointed out that on the 20th, 7 of the top 10 performing posts on Facebook that day were from conservative sources, 3 of which were from Fox News. Another 3 were from the Daily Wire, run by sentient ventriloquist doll Ben Shapiro. Now, let's say I'm a real boy. Hey there, future Salari here. I just wanted to update this a bit and let you know that Kevin Roose actually updates this list daily on @Facebook's top 10, and if you check it out, you'll be able to see that there hasn't really been any changes in the kind of stories that trend on Facebook when it comes to conservative outlets. In fact, in some cases, it's significantly far worse, with an ungodly amount of Ben Shapiro on these lists. I thought I'd update that because it's pretty important to what we're talking about here. Anyway, back to the video. In general, the news media is fueled by outrage, regardless of political leanings. Pretty much every news outlet relies on stories that get under the skin of their audience. Of course, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's good to stay informed about the injustices happening outside our own lives, but the vast majority of news outlets are funded by advertisers, and the most effective way to get people to watch is to give them something to be angry about. We live in a world where we all feel that something isn't quite right, and we turn to the news to explain what that might be and maybe figure out a way how to fix it. It may sound cynical to say, but regardless of how often presenters and pundits on networks like CNN and MSNBC lambasted and outright loathed Donald Trump, I guarantee you that their network executives were overjoyed for the past 4 years because it meant people kept watching and that sweet sponsor money kept flowing in. Oh, and they were more than happy to criticize Bernie Sanders because he was a threat to the wealthy. Funny that, isn't it? Of course, it's not just the liberal news outlets that capitalize on outrage. In fact, their ability to market to anger pales in comparison to right-wing outlets, and I firmly believe that there is no news outlet in the world that does outrage marketing more masterfully than Fox News. If you watch Fox News at any time of the day, there is a very good chance that you'll find one or numerous presenters being angry at something, with a headline on the ticker that sounds just as angry. It might be delivered by an authoritative white male figure who's trying to help the viewer make sense of a complicated world, or a white woman, usually blonde, conventionally attractive, and representing the old-fashioned standard of American beauty, because right-wing media loves to weaponize pretty women in order to appeal to sexist audiences. But that's a subject for a future video, so maybe you should subscribe if that sounds interesting to you. Fox News understands its audience perfectly, and as you're probably aware, the majority of that audience consists of boomers. In 2019, a Pew Research survey found that among the people who named Fox News as their primary political news source, the amount of viewers that were aged 50 or above was 69%. Nice. Those same people also stated that they identified as Republicans. Fox News isn't only the most watched cable news network in America, it's the most watched cable network in America. Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News also regularly has the highest ratings on cable during its primetime slot, despite the fact that it's got about as much charisma as an old Walmart bag filled with expired mayonnaise. The point is, outrage is incredibly lucrative. News networks know this, and Facebook especially knows this. Their algorithm is tailor-made to drive engagement with things that make you angry, and it offers a perfect way for networks like Fox News, The Daily Wire, OAN, etc. to fearmonger and profit. And despite the fact that a tremendous amount of news that's shared is fake, Mark Zuckerberg himself has said in the past that it shouldn't be up to Facebook to fact-check news that's posted on his site, and that it's their responsibility to remain impartial. but inaction can be just as dangerous as action, especially when you're using your platform to enable hate and anger. Boomers trust Fox News. They trust that the stories their friends are posting aren't fake, and politicians and elites will happily tell them that experts aren't to be trusted, that scientists are being paid by George Soros to lie about climate change, or that COVID-19 isn't actually dangerous. That belief might be largely due to repeat exposure to lies, but it's also driven by feelings, ones that were implanted in many boomers since the early days of the Cold War. But at the end of the day, conservative news doesn't care about telling the truth, and Facebook doesn't care that it's spreading lies, because all that outrage coverage means more and more sweet, sweet ad money. Speaking of which. You may have noticed in recent years, and especially in the last election, many politicians on the right frequently using terms that you might not have heard being used for a long time before then. These words include communism, socialism, the left, and the radical left. Many even referred to President Joe Biden as being a socialist and that his supporters were part of the radical left. To be frank, if they think that Biden's a socialist, then that makes me Karl Marx. There's a good reason why this has become such a huge talking point. The majority of people over the age of 50 are overwhelmingly Republican voters, and a lot of these people grew up during the Cold War and the Reagan administration. Because of this, many were raised on a diet of anti-communist and anti-Russian propaganda by the US government. So hearing these words repeated in modern times serves as a way to instill fear in voters who grew up fearing the other. Many boomers grew up after the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, but the climate towards black people and other people of color didn't instantly change as a result, and for decades politicians have been stoking the flames of fear in Americans, especially white Americans, making them believe that they are not like you, so they could be a threat. This fear has extended to other ethnic groups too, including Hispanics, East Asians, and of course, Muslims. These groups have been frequently painted as a threat to the American way of life, that their culture is somehow wrong, and that if they want to live in America, they need to adapt. Republicans have unabashedly pandered to the fears of their voters for decades now. Lee Atwater, who served as a consultant to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, famously came up with the Southern strategy, where he used dog whistle language to appeal to racist voters in the South without using certain slurs towards black people. There was a recording of him explaining this strategy, but I won't be putting it here because, to be frank, it's completely disgusting and YouTube will just bury this video if it's flagged, because apparently they don't like it when people make videos talking about America's sordid past. In the 1970s and 80s, boomers were in the workplace and they were making far more money than people do these days. They were able to move out and buy houses in their 20s, make families with multiple children, go on vacations and not have to worry too much about paying bills. It was a prosperous time for America, everything was working as intended, and by the time they'd retired, a lot of them had a substantial nest egg and property that was fully paid for. If there was any term that encapsulated the 80s, it was that greed is good, and this notion has stayed with many boomers to this very day. A lot of them worked hard to get where they are, and they deserve to be well compensated for their labor, we all do. But as they grew older and future generations started entering the workforce, it became evident that boomers were becoming upset that they were no longer the center of attention. They were raised being told that America is a great place where everyone can prosper and that if you work hard, then prosperity will be a natural byproduct, which for many was true since overall jobs paid better when they were working. But now that my generation and Gen Z are working, whenever we say we want a better life, living wages, free healthcare, pensions, a retirement fund, a house instead of a rented one-bedroom apartment, and even a family, we're told that we need to work hard like they did, and when the solution is raising taxes, they'll fall back on the deeply flawed ideology of Reaganomics and say that we're being bad with our money and need to save up for things like college. And if you've watched my video, Why Do You Hate Your Job?, you'll basically know that it's impossible to save for college unless you can get a job that pays 6 figures before the age of 18. Times have changed though, and many boomers refuse to accept that $50,000 a year just doesn't go very far at all these days. We are working hard, but because a lot of jobs involve sitting behind a computer for most of the day and much of the work that they would do has been simplified, our labor isn't seen as valuable as theirs was. To be frank, I don't want to hear, "You just need to work harder and save," from someone who bought a 3-bedroom house in 1972 just from working part-time at a Dairy Queen. No thanks, Uncle Gary, I don't need your advice. The world is a very different place now, and the reality is that if millennials and Gen Z are to have a better life, it would mean voting for people who are in favor of raising taxes. And because many boomers think that they're entitled to their wealth and that taxes are just handouts to those who are less deserving than them, it's resulted in a generation of sociopaths that believes the world owes them for everything that they've done, and young people just aren't working as hard as them, so they don't deserve a good life. All the generations believing that they're better than the generations that came after them isn't a new concept at all. Gen X does it too, some millennials do it with Gen Z. This goes all the way back to ancient Greece when Socrates said, "The children now love luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter." Okay, ancient boomer, we get the point. Thankfully, millennials and Gen Z tend to get along with each other, possibly because we were born into a similar time in history and we're both on the same boat economically, so we have a mutual understanding on the struggle. I honestly really like that the majority of my audience are Gen Z, because to me it means there's something that we share and that we want to address. It's also good to know that I'm hip with the youths. Don't say that. That wasn't good. Boomers, however, have a special brand of hatred towards younger generations, and it's largely born from the disbelief that we're facing any kind of hardship and refusing to accept responsibility that the world that they built for us is genuinely unfair. You may think it's harsh to use the word sociopath, but to be honest with you, many behaviors of boomers actually line up with the DSM's categorizations of sociopathy. This is a whole subject on its own that I might explore in another video, but if I don't, then I highly recommend that you read Bruce Cannon Gibney's book, A Generation of Sociopaths: How the Baby Boomers Betrayed America. Boomers' sense of self-importance and upbringing in a climate of fear has created people that don't trust outsiders. They feel bitter about the fact that the world has changed drastically around them, and important innovations like the internet and other technologies were brought into prominence by younger generations. They had a hand in building this country, but they don't want us to forget that. At the same time, it's because of them that the world is in such a bad state right now. Frivolous spending and wealth hoarding has put many people in a situation where they can barely afford to live. For the elderly, the internet is a necessary evil, so they limit the spaces they'll visit online. For a good while, their online social spaces were mostly emails that had been forwarded dozens of times that contained poorly written creeds about why liberals and leftists are ruining America, Islamophobic memes about Obama being a Muslim, and comic strips about how young people dumb, young people not know books, how do I turn page, where screen? Oh my god, come up with a different joke. This exchange of ideas has now moved onto Facebook, one of the few sites that boomers visit. But this information is now transmitted faster than the speed of light and much further than your grandma's sewing group. You could argue, does this really matter? It's just how old people are. They're stuck in their ways. In a way, you are right. People develop habits and ideas over time that can seem impossible to change. Boomers were brought up to respect authority and to conform to social norms. The chances of you changing that are slim to none. You may find a post on your Facebook feed from your Uncle Gary about Bill Gates putting microchips in COVID vaccines, or how Joe Biden wants to turn all men gay with a laser, and you'll think to yourself, it doesn't matter, it's not like they're going to do anything. Sorry, but it does still matter, because while your uncle might believe it but not take action, when these ideas are spread on Facebook, they can eventually reach people who can and will take action based on what they've seen. These posts might seem like a ridiculous fantasy that no one could possibly believe, but if you know anything about movements like the QAnon followers, There are people out there who believe in the most outrageous claims, and while not all of them will do something as rash as going into a pizzeria with a gun and demand that they release the children from the basement that doesn't exist, these people can still vote, and boomers in particular are by far the largest voting bloc of active voters right now. Facebook posts can be like a malignant cancer, starting from something as small as a post from your uncle's profile, then eventually reaching into people across the world, all agreeing with each other, all adding their own ideas, and all being exposed to the same lies over and over again. These aren't just wild ideas. News outlets and right-wing figures will go out of their way to defend an establishment that boomers respect so much, even when they're doing atrocious things. Consider how, after a young black person is shot by the police, there are stories and posts flying around on social media pointing out that they were no angel and that they should have listened to the police. And think about how when George Floyd was murdered, people were blaming his health, saying that he broke the law and the police were doing what they were taught, how he was a bad person and this is how bad people end up. As I was in the process of making this video, Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts for the murder and manslaughter of George Floyd. As soon as this happened, those disgusting defenses of Chauvin and the police came back like clockwork. It's horrifying that people will do what they can to justify the death of a human being just to reassure themselves that this is how the world works, and if you step out of line, then these are the consequences. These ideas may have been part of the upbringing for many people in older generations, but Facebook has become the place where these ideas remain alive and become strengthened to the point where people can ignore tragedy to protect institutions like the police. I just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video. What I've said here isn't aimed at all boomers. I know plenty of boomers myself who understand why the world is in a bad shape, that younger generations are struggling, that things need to change, and even that it's the fault of their generation. People like my in-laws and my wife's godparents understand that perfectly, and it's really refreshing hearing that from them. What I've said here comes from a place of empathy. When you've been force-fed lies and fear for decades by powerful figures and organizations, it's understandable how people turn to these ideas that confirm their long-established biases. And it's also easy to see how people fall for these conspiracies. Politicians have presented this simplified reality where countries like the US are good and virtuous, and countries that reject their culture or even reject capitalism are evil, and therefore they need to be challenged. Even the movie industry has played some hand in this. The 80s saw a constant stream of pro-America propaganda movies with fantastical plot lines that weren't too divorced from reality but were interesting and simple enough to be entertaining. In essence, these are the kinds of narratives that have been spread on places like Facebook. The world and politics are complex and honestly quite boring. When the truth is difficult to understand or uninteresting, it can be difficult for some to digest. You can try and teach people that the wealthy are screwing over the working class, and you can try and teach them about wealth inequality, but when they've been told that greed is good and that the rich are deserving of their wealth regardless of whether they earned it or not, and explain how trickle-down economics doesn't work, it becomes hard to internalize and accept when it challenges your bias. Instead, it's easier to blame the other, to believe that jobs are paying less because Mexicans are accepting less money for a job that an American deserves more money for, that they're stealing tax money, that black people are abusing the welfare system and causing all the crime, that all Muslims hate America. I remember at my last job, I spoke to multiple boomers who asked me if I'm glad to be out of England since parts of it have been taken over by Muslims. Of course, I told them that it wasn't true, but I asked where they heard that, and each one of them said someone on Facebook shared a story about it, and that story originated from Fox News.
So, and in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in.
If you have someone in your family that engages in posting and sharing like this on Facebook, then I urge you, please talk to them about it. I know it can be exhausting. I know it can feel completely futile to convince someone to change their minds, but it still needs to be challenged. Back up what you have to say with facts and hypotheticals. Ask them to put themselves in the shoes of other people. Like, if they want to defend a cop killing someone, ask them if they would deserve to be killed if they stole something that can be easily replaced. Or even ask them if they deserve to be in prison for life just for possessing some weed. There's a good chance that they may come back at you with, "I'm older than you, so I know what I'm talking about," or "You're just too young to understand." Just ignore it. Ignore it completely. It's redundant. It has nothing to do with facts, and simply existing for a longer period of time doesn't automatically award you with wisdom, especially if that person has stayed within their own bubble for years. Age does not equal knowledge. More than anything though, if you want to address these issues with a loved one, I ask that you do so calmly and compassionately. Do not attack them or their intelligence, and don't let it turn into a full-blown argument, because people rarely walk away from those believing that they were wrong. In fact, it's more likely that they'll stand by what they said even more firmly than what they did before. The internet may be a wonderful thing, but it's facilitated the spread of misinformation and propaganda more effectively than anything else ever has. If your loved one doesn't have a good grasp on how to use the internet, show them how to fact check the stories that they see. That story I mentioned earlier about AOC banning cows, simply ask them to search on Google, "Does AOC want to ban cows? Fact check," and click on some of the results. Whether they want to accept it or not is up to them, but seeing some opposition does make a difference sometimes. It isn't too late for people to change. Not everyone is too far gone, but if you don't at least try to treat the cancer, it will spread quickly and the damage will be done. Facebook does not care whether their platform is spreading lies. I'm sure there are some people who work there that find it hard to sleep at night, knowing the damage it's done to the world, but Mark Zuckerberg sleeps very soundly and has profited immensely from manipulating the people that you care about, all the while rejecting any accountability. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then please don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that kind of stuff. All that engagement really helps me out as well, so I appreciate it. I also want to thank my supporters on Patreon. You should see their names scrolling down here right now. They're all lovely people who decided to put a little bit forward to help me out. And I would also like to give a special shout out to my $5 patrons and above. That includes Fraser, Mariam, Freetor, Lexi Weiss, Marius Stubberud, Mia Huxley, Venter, Floofpants, Catherine Engelman, Steve Marr, and Tamara, and Neve Breslin. Thank you very much. You're all amazing people, and it really does go a very long way. If you want to put your name up there, don't forget to sign up to my Patreon, and you also get early access to my newest videos when they come out. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Salari TV, and I also have a Discord server which you can see in the description at the bottom. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Delete Facebook, all of it, not just your account, just all of Facebook. It's terrible. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I guess I will see you next time. Alright, bye bye.